Good evening, and welcome to Cocktails and Politics with American Public Square at Jewel. I'm Denisha Snell, Program Director for APS and roving reporter for this evening's program. I'd like to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible, including American Public Square Program Committee, the Membership Committee, and all of the staff and volunteers at APS. I would also like to thank our sponsors for tonight's program, William Jewell College, Marnie and John Sherman, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, and PlexPod. Tonight's Cocktails and Politics features political consultant Terry Nilsson. In his position, Terry ensures that candidates focus on big picture things needed to win on Election Day. Terry has led successful media campaigns for governors, members of Congress, and ballot measures. With more than 2 decades of experience in high-stake races, Nilsson has earned the reputation for being one of the most influential and respected voices in the Republican Party. As always, during American Public Square programs, we welcome questions from the audience. As your roving reporter, I will be watching for any questions you may have for our guest. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you are watching on Facebook, you can also ask questions by posting those in the comments section. With that, I will turn it over to our moderators for this evening, Alan Katz and Mike McShane.
Thank you very much, Denisha. Terry, welcome. Mike? Yeah, we are. Okay. Thank you all for being here. And Terry, in particular, I want to thank you. This is your 3rd appearance at an American Public Square event. You appeared initially with the one we did on the politics of personal destruction, and nearing our 1st year. You came back and we're on a panel on the death penalty and the politics of that, and we're happy to have you back this time. And so let me start this off, Terry, by just sort of asking you to sort of address the issue of what's the state of the race. We've got probably arguably 10 U.S. Senate races that are in play. We could argue whether it's 8, 9, or 10, but it's somewhere in that range. And of course, we have a presidential race. How do you see it? How do you see it all fitting together, or do you see it all coming apart?
I think it's hard to talk about federal races at the Senate or the House level without factoring in fully the presidential race, because the presidential race always has a big impact on how these federal races go for Congress. And if you look historically over the last 3 or 4 different presidential election cycles, it's very hard for a Senate candidate to meaningfully outperform their presidential nominee. So if their presidential nominee isn't performing well in their state, then it's going to have an impact on how Senate candidates perform for either party, and as well as the House. And so what do we know about presidential races? I think the number is of the last 16 presidential races, 5 times the incumbent has been defeated. So it's hard for the incumbent to be defeated. One of the things that definitely advantages an incumbent is the state of the economy. And so because of COVID, as we all know, we've had a big impact on the economy. And so what looked like an advantage for President Trump 6 or 7 months ago isn't the advantage that it is. It isn't the advantage that it was at the time. Where it will be at the end of the day, we don't yet know, although we can certainly say that it won't be what it was. But that doesn't mean that people's mindset about what the direction of the economy won't change, either more positive or more negative. What I've seen, and this has a big impact in campaigns around the country, one of the things I've seen over the course of the last 6 months as we've watched this is, where is COVID in that state at that time? And so if you think about the choice that's being presented to the American voters on this question, that choice is sort of the binary choice that's presented anyway, is economy and jobs versus health, right? And I'm not saying that's necessarily the choice that's there, but that's how it's being presented, and it is to an extent how people are thinking about it. So the more people are in a COVID mentality or concern about sort of the spread of COVID in their neighborhoods, in their states, whatever the case might be, the more they're concerned about health. and the less they're concerned about economy. But the more COVID recedes as a concern, or the COVID crisis in their region recedes as a concern, the more they turn to being concerned about the economy. And so I think that is one of the big questions in this campaign, is where does that stand at the time that voters are voting? A big outbreak, I think, will turn people to health, and that seems to advantage Democrats more, and Democrats are more concerned about that. A continued sort of decline, as we've seen over the last, I guess, month or 6 weeks, whatever it's been, will put people more to the economy. But where do we stand today in the presidential race? If you look at the Real Clear Politics average, Joe Biden's up by about 7%, that margin is narrower in target states. So we have to keep in mind, when we look at national surveys, they're really influenced by a lot of voters. 1 in 7 voters are in California. California's going to vote overwhelmingly against Trump. You have the same kind of thing in New York. Whereas a state like Florida, which Alan, you've got a lot of experience with, is more even right now, right? So a big state that has a lot of influence on the outcome could swing either way at this point. And so what we see in the target states is a much more narrower battlefield. I would say Biden ahead, by and large, but by narrow double digits to mid double digits. And then we see a big battle for the United States Senate. And so you have to give credit on the Democratic side for some good recruitment, and people like Steve Bullock in Montana, and I think John Hickenlooper in Colorado, who I think maybe look better on paper sometimes than he does on the campaign trail. But he was a good recruit. Don't get me wrong. And so we have real races in places like Georgia, and which was, I think, not totally expected. Also real races in places like Colorado and Arizona and other places that I think was totally expected. And so but the battlefield is big, it's wide, it's engaging a lot of people right now, and it's a very contested, close contest. Important to keep in mind, Democrats could lose the Alabama Senate seat. If they lost that, they would need to pick up 3 if they win the presidency. They need to pick up 4 if they don't. So if you factor in Alabama, if you think Alabama is going to go in the Republican direction, then they need to win 4 to have the vice president as a tiebreaker, or 5 to win it without Democrats winning the presidency.
You used a term there when you were talking about the presidential race, the target states.
Yeah.
Are these the typical swing states that we think about? Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan? What are those target states that you're thinking of?
I think all of those are target states. One thing that we do see in this election cycle, I'm in Iowa right now, as we were talking about earlier. Iowa was a state 4 years ago that that Trump was never even, it was never a close contest, right? I mean, Ohio's another state. I don't think Ohio's quite as competitive right now as Iowa is, but both of those states, traditionally very swingy states. Ohio's traditionally been one of the key states, like Florida has been. When Trump was up 4 years ago, or in that campaign, I was doing a Senate race in Ohio, and Trump was never behind. It was never even a question that he was going to win, really. And Iowa was very much in the same boat. Today, Iowa is a competitive state, and both campaigns are fighting it out here. We see some states that last cycle there was talk about Georgia on the Democratic side. This cycle there's more talk about Georgia, and as a competitive state. It looks right now like it's a competitive state. We also see on the other side more sort of talk about Minnesota, and whether Minnesota is continuing to kind of move a little bit more to the right, and maybe Republicans can contest for that. But there are a number of states where Trump or the Republican nominee would historically wouldn't have to worry about, that right now look a little bit more like you have to worry about them.
And when you say that looks like a competitive state.
Yeah.
I'd be interested, because obviously our audience here is a lot of people who are interested in politics, but they maybe don't have access to the same sort of data that you do, or maybe they do. I would love to know, you as a kind of professional political operative, when you're looking at races and states, what are you looking at to say whether it's competitive or it's not competitive, or someone when it's up and it's down? Is it just polls? Is it polls plus other data? What is the type of stuff that you look at to make those calls?
I mean, largely it's derived from polling, Mike. And so we might be looking at really large data analytic samples. And so you're in the data analytics, you might be looking at thousands of people versus what we're looking at in a traditional survey. And those two instruments are not the same. You can't necessarily treat them exactly the same or think about them the same, but you're largely looking at polling data. But you're also looking at historical and demographic trends. And so what is, is there a lot of movement into a state? One of the conventional wisdom pieces, for example, is that out west, Californians are moving into a bunch of these other more Republican states, right? Well, yeah, they are, but it's not really enough to drive substantial changes in the voting behavior of those states, right? And so, you're looking at some of those demographic things, and you're looking at some of the voter behavior things that bring you up into the election. But fundamentally, you're looking at survey research, which is, I know a lot of pollsters, they're friends of mine. I'm not going to say it's always as precise as you think it is when you read the newspaper or watch television, and you have got these breathless commentators talking about this number or that number. It's a moment in time. The thing that I really pay attention to when I'm looking at these are how are candidates being perceived? What is their fave, unfave, right? Do you approve? Do you disapprove? And then usually in any survey, there's a series of questions about both candidates, and then how do voters vote after that series of questions about the candidates. And that gives you a sense of what kind of movement there can be, right? Because if there's no movement, that could be good for you and you're up and you're still up, or it could be bad for you, you're down and you're still down. Or typically is the case, it just shows a pathway to victory. And to me, that's the most important thing about any survey. And that's what I'm looking about. That's what I'm looking for the most.
Well, you threw out the P word, polling.
Yeah.
So I would love, and you kind of with a wry smile. So I feel like there's something interesting here, because look, I think there's a sort of notion out there that when we look back at the 2016 election, that the polls were wrong, that we were going into the election, everyone said Hillary Clinton was going to win, and the polls were wrong. And then someone with the green eye shade says, well, actually it was within the margin. But then, every way that it was interpreted was that Hillary Clinton had this massive advantage there. So What do we get wrong about polling? Like, is the conventional wisdom on that right? Do we use polls wrong? Do we interpret them wrong? How can we be smarter when the newspaper prints a new poll that it can actually inform us in a useful way?
Well, I try not to think too much about what the poll says on the surface. And on the surface, what's reported about a survey is what the ballot test is. And that, trust me, I get the news value of that. And I'm interested in that too, from the perspective of, are the things that the campaign is doing to promote its message working, right? Or are the things that the other side is doing working or not working, right? So in terms of a measure in time, those things are important. But from just a standard consumer of news, when I'm looking at a survey, I have worked with the pollster. I maybe had a role in hiring the pollster. That pollster has a reputation that I can take into account when I judge the data. But when we see that Channel 4 News has done a survey, we don't know any of that stuff. And the average consumer, and I would say even the average journalist, doesn't deal in polling. They don't really know. What they do deal in is clicks on the internet and eyeballs on the television. That's what they deal in, and that's why they're presenting the data to the American public. And so I do think when you look at the aggregated numbers that people like Real Clear Politics do, or 538 does, like these things are more sophisticated layers to look through it. But I think that a lot gets lost in the daily coverage of polling, just because it's really to drive viewership. That's what it's for. That's what most news is for. It's for commercials and getting eyeballs and making money. So
let me ask you a couple of questions here, Terry. First of all, you said earlier that Senate campaigns and candidates are sort of connected, if not at the hip, certainly at the knee, with the presidential candidate. So if the presidential candidate performs well in the state and some of your party, that's of help, and vice versa. Are you saying that if you don't win, and the state that comes to mind for me is Kansas. Kansas is a state that I think it's pretty clear President Trump's going to win. There seems to be a competitive Senate race there. And it would seem to me so my first question is the margin of victory by the president, in other words, if it's down to say 5 points from last time, I think it was probably closer to 15 points, does that affect the Senate race?
It's hard, if you think about the presidential campaign is like a locus of gravity, right, for a Senate candidate. It's hard for them to exceed their vote by more than 5%. And so, the one time it did happen was the Ohio campaign that I was talking about, Ohio earlier, in the Senate campaign that I worked on that year. I think Trump won Ohio by 9 points, and I think Rob Portman won it by 18 or 19 points. And so he really was able to kind of escape the gravitational pull of the presidential nominee, but it's about 5 points. And so if your presidential candidate, your presidential nominee, is losing the state by more than 5 points or winning the state by more than 5 points, then you've got either kind of a rock that you got to carry that might be hard to keep up, or you've got a nice wind at your back.
Yeah, the other thing you said was when you're looking at the internals of a poll and you're looking at the favorable and unfavorable view of the candidate, it's been widely reported that President Trump's unfavorable has been relatively stable. Unfortunately for him, it's been relatively stable in the low 40s as opposed to in the high 40s or low 50s. And I realize that in this day and age, no one's seems to be able to be stable above 50%. But if indeed, after all this time, he's in the low 40s, do you see any prospect of that changing between now and the election? And is that sort of the single most important variable in terms of how you think the election will turn out?
It's an important variable. I think that when you're dealing, so it's a good question, Alan. And I think I would just make a distinction between what you see in non-presidential races versus what you see in presidential races. The candidate images in the presidential race are pretty stable. I think, I haven't done this, and so maybe somebody will ring the bell and call me out. But but I think if you went back and looked at Hillary Clinton's fave-unfave, she came into that race as Secretary of State as the most popular politician in the U.S. But once she became a candidate, it kind of stabilized. And I think probably for the last 8-9 months of that campaign, it was pretty stable. So long way of saying, I don't expect that Trump's image will change substantially between now and the election. I think if there's room for change, it's probably more with Joe Biden than it is with Trump, because people have cast their lots, whether they're for him or against Trump. I think there's still things that people probably have to learn about Biden, in part because of the circumstances we're in with COVID and the way that the campaign has kind of unfolded because of the pandemic. And I think one of the open questions in the campaign is will this ever look like a traditional campaign, right? And would that be, does the Biden team want it to look like a traditional campaign? So in any case, when I'm looking at it for down ballot races, which is any race that's not a presidential race, then I'm looking for movement, because typically if you're moving that number, the fave-unfave for a candidate's going to move before the ballot's going to move. And so if you're growing the favorable for your candidate, or you're growing the unfavorable for your opponent, that's really going to be the first sign that the dynamics of the race are changing.
We'll have some folks that are interested in what's going on here close to home. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the races in Missouri and in Kansas. What do you think's going on there?
Well, in Kansas, I think that we got a good candidate on election day in the primary. I think Washington leadership breathed a big sigh of relief about the outcome there, and so I think folks feel good about that. Outside of the Senate race, I'm not as familiar with the other races in Kansas. I think Governor Parson is in a good spot. Most of the polling that I've seen there has been positive for him. I think Nicole Galloway is going to run an aggressive campaign, and Missouri is a state that's elected Democrats at the gubernatorial level not that long ago. And so it's something that I think folks have to keep in mind. But I think Governor Parson will be reelected.
You think that governors' races are more separated from Senate races from the presidential campaign?
They are. I think we're kind of in a moment, though, with the pandemic that, if you're an executive, you're always judged by your performance. And so, but I do think the pandemic kind of increases performance-related judgments about folks. And it goes back to what I've said, or what I was saying earlier. You do get you get spikes in coronavirus cases, you get declines. You definitely see governors kind of tied to those. Their approval ratings definitely kind of tied to those things, whether that's a legitimate way to judge their performance or not, right? Obviously, everybody plays some part in the spread of coronavirus, and so but they definitely have their approval ratings tied to that. And so as coronavirus cases increases, approvals tend to decline. As they decline, they tend to increase. It's very connected right now.
Well, that would be bad news for Governor Parson right now, but but the election's still 7 weeks away. Let me ask you one other question. If I had told you 6 months ago that there was going to be a competitive Senate race in Alaska, in Iowa, in South Carolina, would you have thought I'd lost my mind?
I'm not convinced that the South Carolina race is really that competitive, but I will.
Okay.
We can argue that out. No, look, Iowa is. I thought. I'm from Iowa, and so I've watched the state, my whole life. It's a traditionally very competitive state, and to me, the anomaly in Iowa was more the 2016 election than it is this election. Governor Reynolds had a very tough race here last time, and she won. She ended up actually having a better margin of victory than I think people would have picked her for in September. But it's a competitive state, and it always has been. And so I'm not surprised that Iowa is competitive. I think the farm economy has also been buffeted here by the China trade talks. It's also been buffeted by some of the ethanol issues, and so there's some parochial things here that are impact the state in ways that wouldn't be impacted elsewhere. Alaska also, again, it has a history at both the federal and the statewide level of electing both Democrats and Republicans, and so it doesn't surprise me that Alaska is a competitive state.
I was reading, I think maybe it was in the Times today or recently, Ross Douthat, who I think is one of the most interesting columnists in America, wrote this really interesting piece about the Trump campaigns and the potential of getting one of the highest shares of the Hispanic vote. There's potential. People are talking about these major inroads and that the Biden campaign might have problems with. What is that? Is that just like a columnist riffing on one data point? Is that a real thing? And if so, what's going on there?
I think some of this, Mike, stems out of some polling that was done in Florida, and in Florida, it looks like some of the Hispanic votes more competitive. Now, the Hispanic vote, and Alan can probably talk at length about it, in Florida comes from a number of different ethnic groups. It's a very diverse kind of ethnicity, or maybe it's national origin is a better way to talk about it. And so it's hard to pick Florida for New Mexico or Texas or other places where the Latino vote tends to be a little more, a little more from the same country, not entirely, but a little bit more than Florida for sure. But there was also some data I just saw the other day out of Arizona that indicated the same thing. I don't know what's motivating it. I don't know what's behind it. But it seems to be real. From what I saw in Arizona just in the last day or two, it doesn't seem to be just a Florida thing. In Florida, you could just probably right, as well as the Cuban vote, right? They don't like what Joe Biden or Kamala Harris did on this, and so they're kind of coming home. But it does appear to be more widespread than that, and it's something that, I mean, it could be an important factor in some of these states with larger Latino populations if it does continue and if it manifests itself on election day.
Well, and it just portends interesting things for our politics. I mean, we've been hearing when I don't know when was it Rui Teixeira and others wrote the kind of demography is destiny thing, and that there's a certain inevitability to our politics, and that may not in fact be true. And I think I think in some ways would be healthy for our politics if it's not something that's sort of explicitly ethnic or racial in barriers, and there's crossing across these things. But I mean, it would definitely scramble the way we have some of these conversations moving forward, because there has been, even in this election and others, there's people talking about this kind of air of inevitability, that the sort of democratic control of either the White House or of the Senate seats is sort of something and potentially maybe it's that thing that's always one election away. But there is this kind of this inevitability to it, which seems to me to be short-sighted. If anyone studied American politics, nothing is inevitable. But like when people bring that up to you, I assume this is an argument that you've heard before. How do you think of that? How do you think of the sort of future of our politics, of Republicans, of Democrats across all these dimensions?
I mean, I think that if anything is a case study for like for the conventional wisdom about the inexorable rise of one group or another group, it is the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, which really was predicated not on a new way of thinking about how to put a coalition together for her. It was predicated on the Barack Obama coalition and how, just because of the demographic change in the country, that was going to get her elected. They didn't think a lot about how they put a coalition together for her, or whether or not she motivated different constituencies inside the Democratic Party and persuaded voters in ways that were different than Obama. I think their campaign was largely a rerun of what the Obama campaign had done in 2008 and 2012, and it didn't work. I do think, look, it's, the Republican Party's had a long debate about these issues, and after the 2012 defeat, there was a large report done on the ways that demographics were changing and the impact that would have on the Republican Party. Some of that stuff got put on hold when Donald Trump got elected because of his approach to illegal immigration and the perception that would alienate that constituency. But I agree with you that, I mean, the reality is that over time, the country is becoming more and more diverse. And I believe that there needs to be a robust debate between the parties, and that one party rule is not good for any state or any country. And so Republicans need to do a good job of competing. And that might happen because people shift because of issues that come about, which frankly happens all the time. If you look inside the Republican Party 10 or 12 years ago, it was a pro-free trade party, but the event of higher income people migrating to the Democratic Party and lower income people migrating to the Republican Party meant that the trade issue shifted inside the Republican Party, and really the first person at the national level who addressed it was Donald Trump. And because of that, that was part of the reason he was able to build a constituency inside the party. And so, you do see these things shift over time, and some of it isn't totally apparent. If you'd said 10 or 12 years ago to people, hey, the trade debate's going to be very different in 2016 than it is today, I mean, we were finding out over NAFTA and, WTO for China and all these other kinds of things. Now, a lot of people who were involved in those fights say, you know what, the guy's right about China. And when you look at the Democratic Party and what Joe Biden has to say about China, he doesn't seem to disagree a lot with the position the president has taken. So anyway, I don't mean to get off on to sidetrack, but like you do see these shifts happen. They happen both because of demographic changes that can happen because of perception that one party isn't addressing the concerns of this constituency. It could happen because a party decides to address them more aggressively. And trade, I think, is an example of that.
Okay, I think we'll go to our roving reporter. Denisha, you have a question.
Yes, I do. Since you've worked for Republican campaigns in the past and largely have worked for the right side of the aisle, can you speak to whether or not it's true that Republicans win elections when voter turnout is low?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I was the, I think, I can't remember if it was in my introduction, but I was the political director on President Bush's reelection campaign in 2004. And I think that, when he was elected in 2000, he was elected as he won the electoral vote, but lost the popular vote. And one of the things that we knew as we were approaching and planning for 2004 is that if you looked at different constituencies and ethnic groups and Democrats and Republicans, if they all voted the exact same way that they had in 2000, we would lose because of growth and different demographics and where our vote wasn't as high. And so we engaged in a very aggressive campaign to turn out more voters. And I think if you told the Democrats one thing in 2004, which was the number of people who were going to turn out, they would have predicted a smashing victory over George Bush, because we had, I think, a 12 million voter increase in 2004 over the 2000 election. My memory could be dated, but it was a large increase. And as we all know the outcome of that, right? George W. Bush won. So I'm not a believer that low turnout advantages Republicans. I think that Republicans have an obligation to make their voice heard and put forward the best messages they can to voters and attract them to their cause. And that's an important part of what campaigns are supposed to do. And so maybe the underlying question is about whether or not everybody should get a mail-in ballot or not. I just got my absentee vote request form from the Republican Party, so I guess we're still for that. But I don't know what more to say about that matter.
Let me just sort of pick up on that thought for a second, though. Not on the absentee ballot, because that sort of is what it is. There is a theory which some of us subscribe to, that this election is essentially baked in, that basically 95, 97% of people know they're either going to vote for President Trump or they're going to vote against President Trump. If that's true, there's really not a whole lot left to be done other than turnout, is there?
Well, I don't know that it's true. I don't know that I'm not going to tell you it's not true, because it might end up being true. But what I will say is I think it's a little more nuanced than that. If you look at surveys and you ask people, regardless of, if you ask people, it's kind of like, who are your friends and neighbors going to vote for, right? If you ask them that question, then Trump does better. If you ask a three-part question, which is that I support Trump and I'm going to vote for him, or two, there are a lot of things that Trump does that really bother me, but he has some positions that I support and I might vote for him, or three, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden. A lot of times those first two equal more than 50% of the vote in a state, in a competitive state. And so to me, the question is, I think that, look, I think there are a lot of people who are going to vote for Donald Trump who don't always like the way he behaves. And so this question gets to those people who might like his policies, but don't like the way he behaves. And at the end of the day, for those voters, the question is going to be, what do I care about more? Do I care more about the policies, or do I care more about the personality? That's the judgment they're going to make. And so I get, like, I know that, there's a lot of partisans out there. And I'm not saying partisans in the sense that I'm a partisan. I'm just saying people who got a camp. But I think when you dig into it a little bit more, there's a little bit more flexibility than that. So I do think turnout matters, but I don't know that we're in all that different of an environment than we were in 2016, when there were people who were voting for Trump who didn't want to say it. I think those people exist. Now, whether it's enough for them, enough for Trump to win enough states, is a question, but those people still exist for sure.
Yeah, the kind of shy Trumper, or
Yeah.
the borrowing from our friends across the pond, the shy Tories. They keep showing up every election. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Ask Jeremy Corbyn about them. But I'm interested, sort of these very people that you're talking about, who sort of make that decision, say, I don't like what President Trump does, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. There was a piece, I think, in the Washington Post today from my former colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Danny Pletka, who says the gist of it is roughly, the first 5 or 6 paragraphs are, these are all the things that I don't like about Donald Trump, but I may end up voting for him because, and this is an argument that I'm seeing in lots of other spaces, which is that Joe Biden is a kind of stalking horse for the much farther left, that he'll be just a sort of figurehead president, and it'll be the AOCs of the world and the Bernie Sanderses of the world and the Elizabeth Warrens who are actually going to be running the show. Like, in the home stretch here, like, is that the pitch? Is that the sort of argument to win those people, that small fraction of people that are still sitting on the fence? Are there other arguments that folks are going to kind of try and, the other arrows in the quiver that they're going to try and pull out, or is that the pitch?
I think a lot of people, a lot of people do point to that. This is more about, I guess, approach than it is about, what everybody thinks the pitch is. But, in my view, it would be better to be more direct about Joe Biden. And he has policies, and we should have, we have a debate every day about Donald Trump's policies. We should have a debate every day about Joe Biden's policies, and he should stand up for them and articulate them and defend them. And to me, the campaign, we would be better off winning the campaign there. I do think that there's a perception or a belief that because the Democratic Party over the last 4, 5, 6 years has come to be dominated, at least in the media perception and some people's perceptions, by the progressive wing of the party, that Joe Biden's not going to be able to withstand that. If that's true, then he should stand up and say that, right? But I haven't seen a lot of that from him. But the reality is that he hasn't campaigned a lot. And we're not seeing a campaign that we would normally see. And some of this I think is strategy on their part. Some of it is the moment in time that we're in, where candidates are out there actively campaigning, engaging with the scrum of the press every day, getting a bunch of questions, and really being subjected to a lot of scrutiny and pressure. That's not happening. And so if it does happen, we'll see what happens. Maybe it'll happen in the debate, if he does a debate. I know some Democrats think Joe Biden shouldn't debate. I guess that will the American people have to judge that as well.
I think we've got another question, Denisha. Is that right?
Yes, we do. So this audience member asked, why is character being framed as personality? Character matters, at least that's what we tell our children, but then allow Trump to be dishonest.
I'm not sure who's framing it that way. I think, look, voters can judge. If voters can judge what they think about Trump. If you want to call it character and I call it personality, that's fine. It's in my mind the same thing. Voters are going to make a judgment, whether or not they support the way the president operates as president from a personality, or as you say, character perspective, or whether they support him from a policy perspective. That's the choice people who are thinking about Trump have to make.
So let me ask you this question, Terry. Traditionally, if you're an unpopular incumbent or less than overwhelmingly popular incumbent, you want to turn it into a choice election. If you are a challenger to an unpopular incumbent, you want to make it a referendum on the incumbent. I mean, this is sort of, I think, sort of politics 101. So the question here is President Trump capable of allowing this campaign to be about anything but himself?
Are you asking if Donald Trump will change his behavior in the course of the next 2 months? I think the answer to that's no, pretty clearly.
But do you think that that undermines what would be the best for his campaign, i.e. a choice election?
I mean, there's not I don't think you can find a supporter, Alan, of the president who thinks he should tweet more. They think he should tweet less. And so, I mean, the part of the thing is like, everybody who thinks all these Trump people like the way that he behaves, they wish he would do less of these things. So I've never sat in a focus group with any voter, Republican or Democrat, who thought that he should keep tweeting. All of them say he should tweet less and be less provocative. But is that going to happen? I mean, I kind of doubt it.
I see we have another question from the audience. Sorry, Denisha, if I'm taking your job on this one, but I was just scanning these, and this looks like a great one. And it's a person that I find a certain kinship in, anonymous attendee. But this person writes, as someone who's voted split ticket before, and as someone who I would say I split ticket basically every single election that I vote in, so I feel kinship with you. I'm increasingly concerned about statements undermining the legitimacy of the elections, up to Roger Stone even recommending martial law with Alex Jones if Trump loses the election. Do you believe the Republican Party will defend the legitimacy of the results, even if it isn't advantageous?
I do.
Asked and answered.
Yeah.
Well, there we go, anonymous attendee. And now, but there is this question though that, do you think, maybe a version of this question, do you think we're going to know who won the presidential election on the evening of November 3rd?
Zero chance.
And what do we think? Like, that can't be good, right? Like,
well, I mean, whether it's good or not, it's just a function of the system we're in. And so, this could be like Florida on steroids in 2020. And part of the reason for this is going to be the election day voters versus the people who are voting absentee or early in some other way, and one of those votes counted. And when you look at surveys today, Republicans tend to be much more election day voters. Democrats tend to be much more early voters, most of them male, but some of them voting early in person. And that partisan split in approach has been exacerbated in this election. And so depending on when a state counts absentee votes, I mean, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to know on election night who the president is. It's very unlikely that we're going to know what control of the Senate is. And that's just a function of how the states decided to count their ballots.
Well, let me ask this question, because you may know the answer to it, Terry. The function is not so much that it's mail-in ballots as it is when they're allowed to count them.
They're allowed to count. That's right.
Florida, for example, will be able to announce by 8:30 that night, they believe, all the early votes and the absentees. Now, probably not the absentees that come in on election day, but in other words, a substantial portion of them. What other swing states, the swing states that you're familiar with, which ones are the ones that can't even start counting them until the polls close?
I just read an article about this, Alan, the other day, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember one state. But there are a number of states. I do think that you have an added complication in that a number of states that haven't had significant mail-in ballot opportunities in the past will have them this time. And they're not really equipped to count ballots by mail. So even if they're permitted to count before the election closes on election day, they may not have the capacity to count. And so, we see some of this stuff going on in New York right now. I think it's all resolved now, but that for weeks after the New York election was held, they were still counting ballots. And so I think you're going to have some states that maybe don't have a history of counting that are going to have issues with counting. And then you also have a group of states that require only that the ballot be postmarked on election day. And so, those states won't be able to finalize a count for some period of time after the election in any case.
But I think we'll know probably, so you have, 538 electoral votes. I suspect that when the polls close in the respective time zones, that approximately 350 of them will be pretty clear. Don't you think so?
I don't know if they're going to be clear enough in the target states.
No, I understand that. But the fact is that at that stage of the game, and you would know, you
Are you saying 350 total electoral votes? Or?
Yeah. I mean, basically, when you look, I mean, there are very few large states that are that basically are swing states. There are 4 or 5, but I mean, they're not.
Yeah.
But your larger states don't seem to be that way. And frankly, the Republican states that run through the Midwest and through the West before you get to the coast probably are pretty easily called early on, I would guess, as California, New York, places like that. I guess, the question really is that when you get down to those other things, and this is a larger question, when they're doing exit polling this time, which will be obviously very different than it ever has been, will part of the data they have be the number of ballots requested by either Democrats or Republicans in those states and in those precincts so that they can try and come up with a number that actually means something?
I mean, they can have that data. Whether or not they can have that data, though, depends on whether the state records how people are registered. So a number of states don't actually require registration. And so in the state that requires registration, you can know how many Republicans and how many Democrats have pulled individual ballots. And you'll have some sense that assumes that, those people are going to vote, some predicted way. I mean, at the what it really comes down to in terms of what are we going to know on election night versus what are we going to know a week later is how close is the election. And if the election is close, then it's going to take longer to sort it out. And if the election is not close, then it's going to take a shorter amount of time.
Denisha, you have one more question there?
Oh yeah, I was going to jump in on this one.
Okay.
I actually got a text message from Denisha saying send this one, which is great, and I do what I am told here. So the questioner from earlier asked us to follow up on these comments about the quote unquote rigged election, declaring martial law. If all of these things that we've been talking about, we don't know who's won the election that evening. I mean, throughout the course of this summer, we have seen major civil unrest in the streets of our cities. I mean, this seems to be a tinderbox that could be set off. So are there efforts afoot to try and tamp that type of stuff down, that we won't be talking about rigged elections, stolen elections, declaring martial law? I mean, but it seems to me the better angels of our natures probably need to do something to quell that language, or is this just part of politics and it's the way it's going to be?
I mean, I don't take the people who show up on Alex Jones that seriously. And so I'm not trying to be flippant about it.
Well, all I'm going to say is, Roger Stone got pardoned by the president, which is.
I understand that. I understand. I got that. But this is a fringe, and there's a fringe in the Republican Party and there's a fringe in the Democratic Party, and those things exist. The question was, as I took it, will the institutional Republican Party support democratic norms? And the answer to that question, in my opinion, is yes, period.
Okay.
So I can't account for what Roger Stone says or doesn't say.
I don't think anyone, who knows if Roger Stone can even account for what he says on a given day.
Well, and I think that all I can say is in terms of not only the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, in terms of the Democratic norms will basically carry the day, is something I think we're all kind of counting on.
Yeah, and just to be like, I don't think, in 2000, the Democrats didn't roll over in Florida and be like, oh yeah, that's what the vote said. There was a legal fight, and I'm not precluding that people shouldn't take advantage of the avenues that are available to them to fight it out and make sure that every vote is counted. But I am saying that the idea that we're going to have chaos in the streets, and I'm not there yet.
Okay, well, Terry, first of all, let me thank you once again for giving us some more of your time and your insight. And it's nice to have you back at American Public Square. I'm sure that we will be dragging you back here perhaps for some sort of a analysis after the fact in terms of what happened and why it happened. And hopefully it won't be while the streets are littered with protesters, and that proves those of us who share your view that in the end, both parties will act responsibly. Hopefully we won't be wrong about that. But thank you once again for being with us. And Mike, thanks for co-hosting this with me. It'll be on our broadcast, both sides. I think we'll in the next day or two. And meanwhile, let me turn it back over to Denisha.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Mike. And thank you, Terry, for joining us tonight. We appreciate that. I would also like to thank all of our supporters who joined us as attendees for tonight's program. I want to invite you all to join us on September 24th for our program on the changing landscape of U.S. immigration law and policy. You can find more information and register on our website. Coming up October 13th, American Public Square is pleased to welcome the co-founders of the Lincoln Project as part of our annual Evening at the Square event. Details and ticket information are available on our website at americanpublicsquare.org. At the conclusion of this event, you will be directed to a short post-event survey. Please take a few moments to complete. This information helps us to improve our events and lets us know what kind of programs our supporters would like to see. Finally, if you enjoyed this program and believe that conversations like these are important, please become a member, or please consider becoming a member of American Public Square. APS members help support our programs and allow us to continue providing space for civil, fact-based discussion. You can learn more about membership and its benefits, again, by visiting our website. Once again, we here at American Public Square at Jewel, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.